Okay, the next thing we're going to go over today is anaerobic cellular respiration. So last lesson we went through aerobic cellular respiration when you have oxygen. This one we're going to go through anaerobic. Now this is not the desirable form of respiration. This is an inefficient way of doing it. It does work, but it creates the toxic byproducts, which we'll talk about, as well as it doesn't create even close to the amount of energy as aerobic does. Okay, so it's kind of a backup plan, but it's not a perfect backup plan. So complex multicellular organisms like us require large amounts of energy, or ATP, in our body in order to perform the reactions that require energy. Anabolic reactions like DNA replication or protein synthesis. Now, because of this requirement, we must regularly perform aerobic cellular respiration. That's what we need to perform on a regular basis. If we stop doing aerobic, we essentially die. Okay, we can do anaerobic and it can help, but it doesn't allow us to stay alive only doing anaerobic. Okay, otherwise you wouldn't need oxygen. You could survive without oxygen, and we can't. Okay. Now, because we need aerobic cellular respiration, the ones with oxygen, it creates it. Why we need it is because it creates most of the energy. Okay. Now, the problem with it is it does require a constant supply of oxygen to the cells performing the reaction. If you cut the oxygen to the cells, it won't be able to perform aerobic cellular respiration. So if oxygen levels drop, so say you're running out of oxygen because you're exercising really heavily, or say somebody's choking you, or you are choking on something, say for some reason your oxygen levels drop, we can still create small amounts of energy using a process called anaerobic cellular respiration, which is just cellular respiration without oxygen. However, this process is inferior to anaerobic because, and these are the two main reasons. One, it creates way less ATP energy and not enough to survive long term. Okay, if you try and burn glucose without oxygen, you will create a little bit of energy, but not enough to survive or for your body to be able to function properly. And then the second thing is it creates toxic byproducts that build up in our bodies and can harm us. Okay, so we really don't want to be doing anaerobic, but we do a backup plan. So humans being multicellular, warm-blooded animals require a tremendous amount of ATP energy being made regularly. Humans require aerobic cellular respiration to be maintained in order to survive, and it is the main form of respiration that most cells are performing. However, in certain cases, particular cells may not receive oxygen at a fast enough rate and are unable to perform the aerobic cellular respiration, the one that we want to do, and then they switch over to the one that we don't want to do, which is anaerobic cellular respiration, okay, without oxygen. So what is anaerobic cellular respiration or anaerobic respiration? Humans don't normally perform anaerobic respiration in every cell, but often occurs in muscle cells. Okay? And this is the stuff without oxygen. So when humans perform anaerobic respiration due to lack of oxygen, we create a toxic byproduct known as lactic acid. Okay? And this lactic acid builds up in the muscle cells and causes fatigue or failure of the muscle to respond. This is what happens when your muscles basically fail. If you are trying to, say, lift a ton of weight, you can do that a few times, but if you continuously keep lifting that weight, your muscles are going to run out of oxygen, and eventually your muscles are going to fail. They're not going to be able to lift that weight anymore. And the reason why they're failing is because they've run out of oxygen and they started to build this thing called lactic acid. And that's the burn that you feel. If you've ever exercised and felt that burn after, why you're feeling a burn is this lactic acid is actually burning your muscles, and that's the burn that we feel. Okay? So lactic acid is also responsible for like I just said, burning sensation during exercise. So let's take a look at an example of what happens. So if you're just sitting there, or just say watching my lecture, you're resting, okay, you have very low ATP needs. Okay, your muscles aren't demanding a lot of oxygen. Your whole body's not demanding a lot of oxygen. Your metabolism is low when you're just resting. Okay, you're not performing cellular respiration rapidly. Okay, so you're performing aerobic cellular respiration as all cells are obtaining sufficient oxygen. There's no lactic acid being produced, and there's no anaerobic respiration occurring. So right now, normally when you're not exercising, you're just resting, you have tons of oxygen inside your body, you're doing the perfect respiration, aerobic. Okay, and that's why you're not becoming fatigued right now. Right? Now, as energy requirements from cells increase, so say you now start doing low to moderate exercise, say you start walking. So you're walking around, you're not running, you're just walking around. Okay? As the energy requirements from the cells increases, it causes an increase in aerobic respiration in order to fill that extra energy requirements. We're still going to do aerobic, so we're still going to use oxygen, but I'm going to have to get more oxygen into my body. Okay, so as aerobic respiration picks up, so does the oxygen need. And therefore, we start breathing heavily and our heart rate increases. And that's just to bring more oxygen into our cells. Now, we're still bringing enough oxygen in. Okay, so we're bringing enough oxygen in. We're still performing only aerobic respiration. We're not fatiguing, we're not burning, we're not building lactic acid. That's why you can walk for a really, really long period of time without fatiguing or your legs just collapsing. Okay, you can walk for hours upon hours over and over again without fatiguing or your legs giving out. And the reason for it is because you're not running out of oxygen in your leg muscles, because you're not overexerting them when you just walk, okay, or at least most people when they're walking. Okay. Let's bring it up to some high-level exercise. Okay? If exercise is intense, the body may require more oxygen than the respiratory and circulatory system can provide. You already tried to increase your breathing rate, you increased your heart rate to bring more oxygen in, but you still don't have enough. Okay? The cells will ensure that any oxygen that's available, the most important cells, the cells of your organs, will continue to receive proper amounts of oxygen. But any non-critical cells, and non-critical cells would be like your muscle cells, because they're not needed to survive, only your organs are. So your muscle cells will only receive oxygen if it's available. So as your body starts running out of oxygen, it basically cuts supply to your muscles and says, whatever oxygen I do have, whatever oxygen I'm bringing in, I'm sending to my brain, or I'm sending to my organs. I'm not going to send them to my muscles. So therefore, muscle cells need energy, like ATP, but they don't have any oxygen to do aerobic because they've run out. So they'll look for another option, and the other option is creating minimal amounts of energy through lactic fermentation or anaerobic respiration. These two things mean the exact same, okay? Lactate fermentation or anaerobic respiration. So you are not producing enough energy, okay, there's a typo there, does not produce enough energy, muscles will eventually fail, lactic acid gets produced, and you get that burning sensation, okay? And it's just in your muscles. You're not going to get that in your brain because your brain still has enough oxygen to do aerobic. It's just your muscle cells that are doing anaerobic, and now they're producing a nasty product. Okay? So just a reminder of this word fermentation. So the process of respiration without oxygen, okay, it's called fermentation. Okay, so anaerobic respiration is another way for saying create lactic acid. Okay, so we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration, and we're going to kind of first talk about it. We already talked about it kind of in humans, and then we're now going to talk about it in yeast. And they don't actually create lactic acid; they create another product called alcohol or ethanol. So on accident, a long time ago, people noticed that yeast, which is a living organism, just like a cell like in our body, okay, produces a different toxic byproduct than humans during anaerobic cellular respiration. Okay, all living things perform anaerobic cellular respiration at certain points. So yeast, if forced to, okay, if you force yeast to do anaerobic cellular respiration, if you don't force them, they're going to do aerobic. Just like how we prefer to do aerobic, they'll do aerobic too. And they'll only produce CO2 and water. But if we force them into doing anaerobic, they'll actually produce ethanol for us. Okay? So ethanol fermentation is similar to lactate fermentation, but the pyruvates are transformed into ethanol and CO2 instead of lactic acid. So yeast and certain bacteria are the organisms that are capable of doing this. If you take a bunch of yeast and take a bunch of bacteria and you remove all their oxygen, they'll still try and make energy, but they'll do it through anaerobic respiration, and they can produce alcohol. And this is how we produce our alcohols, beers, wine, spirits, car ethanol, any kind of alcohol. It's all made primarily through this function. Okay, so let's try and compare the two. Okay, if we take a look at aerobic respiration, the one that we want to do, okay, the one that produces just energy, tons of energy. Okay, all it is we got glucose, and then we go through pyruvate oxidation, and then the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain, and we got tons of energy out. Okay, 36 ATPs plus the 2, so we got 38 ATPs. Okay, the great process, we want to be doing this all the time. Okay, now anaerobic is when you don't have oxygen, and if you don't have oxygen, you notice that you're not going to see 38 ATPs at all. You can create a little bit of energy, okay, like 4 here and 2 here, but nothing like the 36 that you can produce over here. So you produce small amounts of energy. Now remember, the other thing is if you don't use oxygen, you produce these nasty byproducts. Okay? In humans, it's lactate. Okay? So in humans, if we don't use oxygen and we try and burn glucose, we'll produce lactate. And then if you are a yeast, Okay, you don't produce lactate, you actually produced ethanol. Okay, and those are the two nasty byproducts from not proper respiration. Okay, so now we're going to go simply how to make alcohol. Okay, it's a very, very simple process. The process for making beer or making wine or making spirits is all exactly the same. And it's actually a very simple process. Okay, and I'll kind of outline it here. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to take some yeast. Okay, so you have to buy some yeast cells. Okay, and you can buy these in various spots. Okay, in the grocery store, you buy some yeast cells, and that's all a yeast cell looks up close up. Okay, it's just a normal cell. Okay? Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to feed them. So if you were going to make wine, you were going to feed them sugar from grapes. Okay, and you'll get a little bit of a sweeter taste in your alcohol. Okay, but remember, these grapes are just full of sugar. So we're going to feed the yeast sugar. Now, if you're going to make beer, you're going to grab the sugar from a different spot. You're not going to grab it from grapes. You're going to grab it from basically what they call malt. Okay. So basically what this is wheat. Okay, so it's basically all grounded up wheat, and all that is it's sugar as well. Okay, it's just a polysaccharide. So you're going to give these yeast sugar to eat. Okay, and while they eat it, you want to make sure that they don't have oxygen. Okay, we have to remove all the oxygen because if they have oxygen, they're going to burn and do regular respiration, the one that we want to do, and only produce CO2 and water. So what we have to do is we have to remove all that oxygen. So now they're going to try and eat the grapes and the malt without oxygen. And if they do it without oxygen, they'll start producing alcohol. Okay? So let's go through it more step by step. So ethanol fermentation. Okay? So I'm going to go through the process of making wine and beer. The first thing, you're going to choose your sugar. Okay? So you're going to choose what sugar. If you're going to do wine, you're going to use grapes or any kind of fruit. You can make wine out of pears or any kind of fruit, bananas, whatever fruit you want. You're going to use barley or some oats, okay, in order to make beer. So you pick your sugar. Next, we're going to give yeast to the sugar. So we're going to take this yeast and we're going to add it to the sugar. And you put them in these giant vats. So right here is a vat. This is actually from I've gone through a couple breweries on some tours. So this is at the Heineken factory in Amsterdam. So this is basically a vat that they're pouring in yeast and barley. Okay. Now, the other thing they have to do with this vat is these tubes right here that you're seeing, these tubes eliminate all the oxygen. So we're going to put the yeast in the air, put a bunch of barley or sugar inside here, and then we're going to eliminate all of the oxygen. Okay. Eliminate all the oxygen, and we let it sit in there. We let that yeast basically eat the sugar. Okay. So we allow fermentation to take place, which is anaerobic respiration. Okay. And during fermentation, CO2 is produced, which keeps the oxygen out. So this is just basically a vat, and this guy's just kind of checking on his beer right now, seeing what stage it is. Now, normally this would be sealed. Okay, so the door is normally shut and there's no oxygen in there. He's just checking on it. So you allow this fermentation to take place. Different beers will take different amounts of time. Same with wine. Some wines take longer, sometimes a little bit less. But after you're all done, okay, and after you've let it sit there for a while, and now basically alcohol is being made in here. So we've got alcohol being made inside here. After a while, the mixture, when you're all done, the mixture is filtered and allowed to settle. Now, if it's wine, okay, your concentration is maxed out at 10 to 15%. You can't get any higher because as it starts making alcohol, remember alcohol is a poison. So it gets anything higher than 10 to 15%, the liquid becomes so poisonous it kills all the yeast. And with the yeast dead, they can't perform cellular respiration, okay, and they can't make any more alcohol. So that's why wine is capped out at 10 to 15%. Okay, if you're going to make a beer, you're probably going to cut it off a little bit earlier. But if you're going to make wine, you cut it off at, say, 10 to 15%, all the yeast die. And then you don't even need to pasteurize it. And what pasteurizing it means to superheat it. Okay, because the alcohol concentration is so high, it basically kills all the microorganisms. So a long time ago, before we had purified water, although it sounds crazy, it was actually healthier to drink wine than water because water had a whole bunch of microorganisms and were making people sick. But if you drank wine, because the alcohol concentration was so high, it would kill any bacteria or anything in there, and it was actually safer to drink wine than water. Now, if you're going to make beer, it's a little bit different. If you're going to make beer, you cut it off early. Okay, you don't allow it to just go to the end. If you did, you'd have 15% beer, which tastes horrible. Okay, so you usually cut it off at 4% or 5% or 6%, depending on how strong of a beer you want. Now, since most beer is 4 to 8%, beer must be pasteurized. Okay, so we actually have to take beer and we have to superheat it. The alcohol concentration isn't high enough to kill all the microorganisms, so we pasteurize it. And pasteurizing it means superheating it. We do the same thing to milk, okay, and that kills all the microorganisms. Then we bottle the beer, we bottle the wine, and then we enjoy the alcohol response. Now, we've talked about fermentation, we're basically talking about alcohol, but there is other types of fermentation that happen, and it all uses basically taking microorganisms and preventing them from eating with oxygen. We basically make them eat food without oxygen, and that can produce all kinds of things. So cheese, okay, yogurt, soy sauce, wine, beer, nail polish remover, rubbing alcohol, vinegar. All this stuff is made by basically taking microorganisms, and these are the microorganisms right here, all kinds of different types of bacteria. Okay, and there's a couple fungi in there as well. We take these microorganisms, give them some sugar, remove the oxygen, and if they do, they can make these products for us. Okay. I'm not going to go too much into this, but our production of ethanol here in Chatham as well at the ethanol plant, they do the same thing. They just basically take corn, take yeast, remove all the oxygen, and they turn corn into alcohol. Because you can take any fruit or vegetable or any plant essentially, and if you give it to yeast and the yeast like to eat it and you remove the oxygen, you can turn any plant into ethanol.